Games Telling Stories, a brief note on games and narratives by Juul. This paper investigates the degree to which we can regard video games as forms of narrative and comes to the conclusion that while games intersect with elements of narration, they're not essentially reducible to narration itself, which requires us therefore to rethink how we study games. Juul is polemic in his paper and criticizes narratologists who try to study games only by the means of literary theory. The operation of framing something as something else works by taking some notions of the source domain, narratives, and applying them to the target domain, games. This is not neutral, it emphasizes some traits and suppresses others. What he means with framing may be seen as form of subjective projection, literary scholars projecting their favorite traits towards the game that they are studying. This, according to Juul, is false, as it is teleological and reduces the analysis of games to what the literary researcher wants to see and analyze. Therefore, Juul suggests in his paper to first compare our normative understanding of narrative to some cases of games, to see how narrative actually appears in video games. He brings up 3 things in common and 3 things that differ games from narration. There are at least 3 common arguments. First, we use narratives for everything. Second, most games feature narrative introductions and backstories. And third, games share some traits with narratives. On the other hand, games are not part of the narrative media ecology formed by movies, novels, and theater. Time in games works differently than in narratives, and the relation between the reader, viewer, and the story world is different than the relation between the player and the game world. Now, in this paper, Juul is onto trying to find an essential element within games that delineates them from mere narration. Narratives may be fundamental to human thought, but this does not mean that everything should be described in narrative terms. And that something can be presented in narrative form does not mean that it is narrative. He concludes that narration is just the way how we communicate. This means that even when talking about things that are not narration as such, we are required to narrate our information about them to simply communicate our insight, which gives the impression as if the object that we're talking about is the source of its narration, even though it is us narrating the object that we're talking about. Despite of that, most games do contain elements of narrative within their game to rationalize gameplay, such as in the game Space Invaders. Our goal is to shoot incoming forces of aliens. The game itself, however, is just a loop in which we basically shoot at targets with stylized shapes. Yet the designers of the game decided to give us a backstory that we are defending our planet to allow us to rationalize our actions as players. The story is not essential to the gameplay, but it adds to the overall experience. Furthermore, games appear most often in a linear fashion and contain characters which are essential for narratives. This does not apply to all games, though, which he refers to later in his paper. Now, Juul gives more examples, but what he essentially tries to explain is that narrative appears in most games as a feature that rationalizes our activities to make them more meaningful. This, however, does not mean that narratives are essential for the core gameplay itself. What Juul wants to arrive at is that the essential element that lays at the heart of gameplay is interaction. He analyzes this aspect by taking a closer look at interactive story games. In an interactive story game, where the user watches video clips and occasionally makes choices, story time, narrative time, and reading, viewing time will move apart. But when the user can act, they must necessarily implode. It is impossible to influence something that has already happened. This means that you cannot have interactivity and narration at the same time. And this means in practice that games almost never perform basic narrative operations, like flashback and flash forward. Games are almost always chronological. The core message here is that interaction is not narration. As narration happens always retrospectively, narration refers basically to the things that are laying in the past, even if what happened was seconds ago. But since interaction is more essential to games and narration secondary, according to Juul, we must be looking at interaction first to understand games. Juul highlights that he doesn't mean that readers of books or viewers of movies are not active in the sense that they can interact intellectually with the content of their media, but in a game players can and must change the state of the game in order to reach either their own goals or the game design's goals. Regardless of how hard we interact intellectually with a narration in form of a book or a movie, it will never change how these media are written and narrated. In books and games, the story and its presentation never change. While in games, our interaction changes the presentation of the game itself. The game state changes continuously. In Juul's conclusion, he returns back to the differences and comparisons he lists at the beginning of his paper. The comparisons being that the player can tell stories of a game session. Many computer games contain narrative elements, and in many cases the player may play to see a cutscene or realize a narrative sequence. Also, games and narratives share some structural traits. Nevertheless, my point is that games and stories actually do not translate to each other in the way that novels and movies do. There is an inherent conflict between the now of the interaction and the past or prior of the narrative. You can't have narration and interactivity at the same time. There is no such thing as a continuously interactive story. The relations between reader story and player game are completely different. The player inhabits a twilight zone where he or she is both an empirical subject outside the game and undertakes a role inside the game. Or to make it really short, in analytical and logical terms, interaction lays at the core of video games. And since interaction is not narration, narration cannot be at the core of video games.